Good morning, everyone. We'll just get going. I think some people are still having their coffees and morning pizzas. We'll proceed and we'll get going. So we're in the session on conceptualizing sustainable and inclusive pathways. My name is Edgar PIETERSE. I am based at the University of Cape Town, and I direct something called the African Centre for Cities. And I think part of why I've been asked by the organizers to chair this session is that during the last year and a bit, we've been working with National Treasury and the Presidential Climate Commission on an urban component of the just transition. So it's called the Just Urban Transition, and it's a policy frame that came out a couple of months ago. So, of course, as we know, South Africa has been hailed for being one of the leading countries to really adopt and run with the scaffolding of a just transition. Not unique to South Africa. We've seen other significant middle-income countries being equally aggressive. For example, Indonesia, at the end of their presidency of the G20, announced an investment package that's about twice the size of South Africa's GDP. And we know that in Chile, Colombia, and other countries, this is all very much on the agenda, and as we've heard this morning. Of course, at the heart of the South African frame that is being socially intermediated by the Presidential Climate Commission are three dimensions of justice: restorative, distributive, and procedural. And what this session will do is we will have scholars and researchers reflecting on the assumptions of that approach to the just transition from a feminist and other perspectives. And the idea is to understand whether the framing is robust enough to ensure that indeed we are able to address some of the profound and stubborn inequalities that characterize our society. We've got 4 presentations. The organizers have asked each of them to be highly disciplined, about 15 minutes. So I'll be fairly brutal and do a wicked alarm at 13 minutes so that they know they've got to wrap up. The first presentation is how could we define a just energy transition in South Africa? And Tracy Ledger from the Public Affairs Research Institute will share with us her thoughts. We will then move on to a double act from 2 colleagues from the Southern Center for Inequality Studies at Wits University, Imraan VALODIA and Katrina LEHMANN-GRUBE. And then we will move on to a colleague that is online from the University of Manchester, Gindo, TAMPULOBON, who will speak to us on climate justice for persons with disability. And he's done extensive empirical work, particularly in Indonesia. So I think it would be really fascinating to get that comparative perspective. And then Julia Taylor will close us off with a paper on just and energy transition, a gendered analysis of energy transition in Northern Cape, South Africa. We will move through these one after the other. And at the end of it, we will have an opportunity to ask some questions to respond to the papers. But if you are happy with that, we will proceed. And Tracy, the floor is yours. And welcome, everyone.
Hello, everyone. So what I wanted to talk today is about how we understand what a just transition is, how we define it, and the imperatives for having quite a different definition in the global south, and particularly in a country like South Africa, than the sort of standard definitions that we've been inheriting from the global north. And I think that definition is important. It's not just sort of an academic nicety, but that definition then defines the scope and reach of policies and programs, and very importantly, it impacts how we allocate resources. Whatever's in the definition of a just transition is going to be included for funding and prioritization and focus, and whatever isn't included is not going to receive that attention. So I think the commonly held definition of the just transition is about how do we make the transition from one kind of energy system to another kind of energy system just, and specifically with reference to people who work in the coal value chain and people in coal mining areas. And that is where the first problem arises. And we've seen that very clearly in fieldwork that we've been doing in Mpumalanga around the first decommissioned coal power plant. And so when we're talking about people who are working in the coal value chain and coal communities, it's very much defined by who gets captured in official statistics and who works in informal value chains. And this kind of sort of a priori assumption about who is the problem and thus who is deserving of a solution effectively excludes significant numbers of people. And it specifically excludes the most vulnerable and the most marginalized, and therefore isn't doing much for inequality. So just as one example, there are a lot of women in the community around Komati that would have informal businesses selling food to coal truck drivers who came through to the power plant, or to contractors that are working there. They are completely excluded from any of the plans to address people who are going to lose their incomes, and they are definitely going to lose their incomes, and they're people who very much cannot afford to do so. There are all sorts of people in the local community that were deriving extra income from renting out rooms in their houses or backyard rooms, once again to contractors that would come to the coal power plant. So that is one way in which our definition of the problem that we need to address is in fact ignoring everybody who's tangentially involved. We're also starting to uncover an issue with labor brokers. So for example, a lot of people that are losing their jobs and who are employed there are in fact not employed by companies directly in that coal value chain. They're employed by labor brokers. And there doesn't seem to be a strategy to deal with people who are employed as labor brokers or to reskill them. They simply sort of disappear out of the system. The second problem with that is that it seems to specifically exclude people who are negatively affected by the energy transition but don't work in the coal sector. So once again, we found communities in the Northern Cape that are being deprived of access to land. They're being deprived of access to their ancestral burial sites, all in the name of green hydrogen. But because they're not in the coal sector and because they're not in Mpumalanga, they are rendered almost entirely invisible in this. And there's no thinking about how other parts of the energy transition that are happening outside of the coal value chain are in fact impacting people. And once again, these are the poorest, most vulnerable, most marginalized communities, and therefore this is exacerbating inequality. But I would say that although this is important, this is only a small part of what is missing from our definition excuse me, of a just energy transition. So our conceptualization of justice, social equity, and social justice is specifically attached to the transition from one kind of energy system to another kind of energy system. But it's not dealing with the energy system we have and the energy system we want to have in the future. So it's about the transition, not about whether the future energy system is more socially just and equitable than the one that we currently have, apart from issues around sustainability and climate change. And many of the most serious facets of poverty and inequality are directly related to the energy system. People's ability to access clean and safe energy, people's ability to be able to afford energy are directly related to poverty and inequality. And these are not issues of the energy system that are really getting what I would say are sufficient attention in the transition. So we're focusing on having a just transition. We're not focusing on transitioning to something that is more equitable and socially just. And just to go back to one of the JET framework issues on procedural justice, of course, the reason why so many people in the transition are invisible, and the reason why we haven't significantly problematized the issue of the inequalities in the energy system is because there are big problems with the way in which we're doing public participation, but that's a different debate. I mean, we're not delivering procedural justice, and because we're not hearing people's voices, we're not including these issues into policy. So what happens is that we do have this focus on when we say access to clean and safe energy. I mean, the Global Commission to End Energy Poverty, SDG 7. But the problem is that we're not clearly understanding, I don't think, the challenges of an equitable energy system in a country like South Africa versus what we see in the global north. So we are seeing the answer to inequality in energy as inclusion into a clean and safe energy system. But simply including people into the system by giving them access to an electricity connection that's powered by renewable electricity is not sufficient to ensure that we have pro-poor and equitable outcomes. I'm very much a fan of the adverse inclusion framework, which says the way in which you reduce poverty and inequality is not by inclusion into a system per se, it's the terms on which people are included into the system. And what we can see is that the poorest and most vulnerable households, even though they might be connected to the electricity grid, South Africa's got an 86% household electrification rate, the terms of their inclusion are not good enough to contribute to significant reductions in poverty and inequality. And the most important issue around that is people's ability to afford a certain amount of electricity. Okay, it's not enough to say people have got access to electricity and they can use the 1 kilowatt hour per household per day. There's a certain minimum threshold level of electricity consumption, and I'm using electricity as kind of shorthand for other things you'd use in a household instead of that, below which you have only a marginal improvement in people's quality of life. There's a certain threshold level of consumption which is necessary for people to actually be able to improve their lives, to be able to engage in more and better livelihood opportunities. There are significant linkages between the ability to access a certain amount of electricity and the food security and child malnutrition status of a household. Cooking is the main demand, reason for electricity demand in South Africa and in many developing countries. It allows households to store food. Home cooked food is cheaper and more nutritious than purchased food. Some of the more nutritionally dense foods require longer cooking times. Our work has shown that, in fact, people understand that, for example, cooking beans is much more nutritious than quick cooking maize meal, but they can't afford the electricity for the longer cooking times or the paraffin. So we've calculated that amount, minimum threshold of electricity in a household, in a South African household, is 350 kilowatt hours per household per month. But that would cost about 800 Rand a month for a household. So the question is, what is affordable and what is not affordable? Once again, in the global north, the common definition is to look at the percentage of household income that's being allocated to energy. I think that there are two problems with that. The first thing is that you can't look at how much households are currently spending on electricity, because people tend to self-regulate and only spend what they can afford. You need to look at the cost of that 350 kilowatt hours per month. And if we consider that a quarter of South African households, about 4.5 million South African households, live below the upper bound poverty line, then clearly on a percentage basis, that 800 Rand a month is much more than 10% of their income. But there's something more important than that. So there is this assumption that if we move to renewables, which are cheaper than fossil fuels in many instances, and if we optimize everything that goes on in distribution, and we have these fabulously, perfectly operating companies, we will end up with an electricity tariff that is going to be affordable for all poor households. But once again, if we go back to the 25% of South African households that live below the food poverty line, and there are tens of millions of households like that around the world, no tariff is affordable for a household like that, because every single cent that the household is spending on electricity, most of that comes from the household's food budget. And research that's been done by Black Sash in South Africa on childcare grant recipients shows quite clearly that the main competitor in households for food is, as a share of household income, is electricity. It's the one thing that you can adjust. It's very difficult to pay your landlord less rent or pay a taxi driver less on a taxi fare. So people reduce their food income in order to pay for electricity. That survey also showed that the main reason why the women who are childcare grant recipients borrow money is in fact to pay for electricity. So if we have a situation where we want to remove this trade-off from households, because this trade-off is fundamentally detrimental to reducing poverty and inequality. We've already seen, we see in South Africa more than 1 in 4 children is stunted, and that is to do almost entirely with the cost of food. The vast majority of South Africans buy their food. There's a direct linkage between that and poor cognitive development in children. They can't learn in school. And there's a strong link between significant childhood malnutrition, the kind that affects 1 in 4 South African children, and a significant increased propensity for violence in adults. So South Africa's high levels of domestic violence, a significant portion of that is probably attributed to our high levels of childhood malnutrition. So it's in all of our interests in terms of reducing poverty and reducing inequality for a significant percentage of the population to have all of their minimum household consumption available to them for free. And if we look at, if we say 55% of households live below the upper bound poverty line, in order for them to be able to access electricity without impacting their food expenditure, they would probably also need to have a significant amount of that electricity access for free. And you can see it doesn't matter how good you were at your MBA and how brilliant you are at managing your electricity distribution company, you're not going to be able to supply electricity to a significant percentage of the population at zero. So by focusing only on physical inclusion into the system, we're actually not building, we're not transitioning to an energy system that is going to reduce inequality and poverty. And the problem is that there are currently no significant plans, programs, or resources to ensure that that is actually going to happen. Because when we look at South Africa's just energy transition, there is some work about increasing access and addressing the electrification backlog, but there's no thinking about how we're going to fund a more equitable energy system in the future. Thanks.
Thanks so much, and I really appreciate the very clear policy implications that are being drawn out, and I think it's going to set up for a really rich conversation. Imraan?
Can we have the slides up? So I'll start in the meantime. I'm going to be really quick because not only do I have to leave enough time for the 2 acts we're doing, but there's kind of 2 more papers to come, so I'll be really quick. So this is joint work that we're doing with a group at SEIS. Kind of the 2 of us get to present it, but it's the outcome of large amounts of work by 5 of us. So the kind of idea of a just transition has been used probably in the last 5 years. The word just transition has been used almost as much as the word COVID. But we would argue that the gender dimensions of a just transition are really not sufficiently thought through, and this is important because if it's not, then the kind of transition will either kind of replicate existing inequalities that are based on gender, or else much more of concern, they'll kind of exacerbate it. We think that this is kind of especially important for countries in the global south. So what our paper tries to do is to set out a set of principles for kind of thinking through the gender questions, through kind of reviewing some kind of some of what we know from the existing theoretical and empirical work that's been done. So kind of if we think about it theoretically, I think there's a fair amount of evidence to suggest that kind of really important issues related to climate change, such as kind of health and water, are, while not exclusively, certainly primarily the responsibilities of women kind of in households. And there's a real concern that the climate transition that we're likely to see is and will exacerbate a kind of crisis of care and social and kind of social kind of reproduction. So just to give you one example, what we are seeing is major increases in kind of food prices, kind of serious problems related to food security, and I think these issues really play out in kind of households and relate to this problem of a crisis in social reproduction. I think it's kind of important to note that these impacts come through kind of constructed norms, and are not really based on real differences between genders. So let's just take two kind of examples and kind of share with you some of the concerns. If we kind of take the kind of energy transition, and I just want to focus on two things. Think about the kind of design of renewable projects, and kind of how renewable kind of energy is really being rolled out. One important gender issue is that much of the grid design is not really designed to deal with energy use for kind of for the production of food. Another example, think about the think about time use and how energy systems are changing. So as we carbonize, we increase supply, kind of supply of kind of electricity. That kind of changes time use. For men, that essentially means a lot more time off and leisure. Kind of really for females, it means changing from one pattern of time use in the household to something else. And I think there's no increase in leisure, kind of is the essential point. A second example would be kind of questions of land are really important to the transition. I think we know, we know from the literature that kind of questions of ownership of land are really fundamentally issues of gender, and the patterns with which land's being used kind of in this transition. What's kind of quite clear from the evidence to date is that it's largely shifting the resources towards men at the kind of at the expense of much of the income generation that happens for females. So those are just kind of some kind of examples for kind of how we're thinking about these issues, and I'll pass on here to Katrina.
Thanks, Imraan. So I think what Imraan has shown is kind of we're already seeing that climate change itself has gendered impacts, but we're already seeing that transition policies are having potential negative and gendered impacts at the same time. So kind of what constitutes justice as part of the just transition? These are the 4 pillars of justice that have kind of been widely used in the literature. 3 of them are used also in the South African just transition framework. Those are distributional justice, procedural justice, recognitional justice, and restorative justice. So kind of one of the big criticisms of the just transition, which I think Tracy also spoke to, is that there's been this narrow focus on formal jobs and maintaining the status quo. But kind of a question then raises, what are the injustices of the status quo? And we argue here that similar economic structures and power dynamics that have contributed to the ecological crisis have also produced the intersecting gender, race, and class inequalities that we see. Sorry, can I maybe drop this? Just because I can't see the slides. Or maybe just shift it like this. Yeah, that's better. So feminist theory offers kind of several key concepts to expand the conception of a just transition, to support gender justice, but also to kind of avoid these reductionist approaches. So these are some of the core concepts that we find coming out of the feminist literature. The first being care and social reproduction, and the importance of both of these, but also kind of their crisis, their state of crisis at the moment, and the importance of redistributing these not only within the household, but kind of society more broadly. Secondly is access to resources. So resources such as land and water are highly gendered, but also kind of highly privatized and commodified. And so feminist literature is kind of looking at alternative approaches to thinking about how resources are divided, who gets access, who has control over them. The third one is intersectionality, so trying to understand the intersecting ways in which the structural determinants of inequality and injustice work together, so whether that's gender, class, ability, etc. Then the last one is knowledge creation. So feminist scholars have been very critical about the ways in which kind of knowledge is not only produced, but which knowledge is valued, what are the underlying kind of assumptions in that, and then trying to foreground alternative knowledge systems in that approach. And then lastly, thinking about alternative approaches for how we construct our economy and what kinds of things we really prioritize. So whether that's kind of reframing around away from kind of growth in GDP to thinking about more sustainable, inherently sustainable approaches of sufficiency, regeneration, and provisioning. So the 4 pillars of justice kind of have been applied to the just transition, but they've very rarely been interpreted or applied or implemented from a kind of a gender dimension. So what we do in this paper is we kind of think of the 4 pillars of justice, but we use some of the learnings of the feminist literature and apply it to kind of reinterpret these 4 pillars with this lens. So the first is distributive justice. So firstly, this is thinking about equal access to decent work for women, but very importantly also about rights and entitlements for informal workers who are overwhelmingly women across the global south. It's also about access to and control over resources such as land and water, because these form the basis of many livelihoods, less so in South Africa, but certainly in other parts of the continent. We find that transition policies can't only be defined by institutionalized privileges like land ownership, but also need to be based on understanding the uses, needs, and responsibilities of those who rely on those resources. So kind of even though land is maybe predominantly male-owned, actually the work that's being done on that land for subsistence agriculture in many parts of the world is being done by women. The public and affordable provision of social goods, whether that's education, healthcare, energy and water infrastructure, social protection. This is to relieve and redistribute some of the care and social reproductive work that's being done in society, and that will certainly increase with climate change. So kind of all in all, this requires a transformative approach to thinking about how the economy is organized, what types of labor are valued, how that labor is distributed, and how and where economic resources are channeled. The second is participatory justice, so rebalancing the focus of participation from elites to marginalized groups. This is about kind of how procedures are designed equitably, who gets to be included, how are inputs given, what times of day are they done, how they consider kind of different groups, but also recognizing that those inputs must be valued as kind of expert in their own right for their own experiences. And then I think something that's really been missing in South Africa is that they need to be democratically considered and actually reflected in outcomes. I think there's a lot of conversation about kind of consultation, but how is that then reflected in outcomes? And here we see that participation must form the basis for redistribution, so that participation and procedural justice is embedded within new governance, management, and ownership regimes, so that it doesn't stop at kind of the consultative process. Thirdly, recognitional justice, so recognizing social inequalities, but also understanding how they arise and are perpetuated by structures, acknowledging what different groups have already done, and then recognizing and incorporating different knowledges and values, and thereby changing the metrics, indicators, and goals of the process itself. And so shifting away from thinking of this as a kind of purely technological problem. But this requires like new approaches, goals and guiding frameworks for what a transformative economy would look like. And the feminist literature, as I mentioned, kind of has written extensively about ethics of care, both for people and for the environment, and resisting the commodification of nature. And then lastly, restorative justice. So acknowledging and repairing harms which have been highly gendered. So kind of in the coal value chain, miners have been kind of overwhelmingly male, but women have been impacted in other kinds of ways through that process. Restoration of the environment, and also restoration of the land and the commons. And ultimately, this is talking about repairing the harm caused by systems which have resulted in the structural inequalities we've observed, whether that's colonialism, land dispossession, and the fossil fuel dependent development of the global north. And here I think we haven't spoken, I think, enough in this country about kind of climate reparations, both internally but also at a local level, given the massive kind of both income inequalities, but also contributions to climate change. So just to conclude, so the transition is underway in many countries, including in the global south, but the gender justice dimension has been neglected. And we kind of argue that if this continues, the transition has no way of being just at all. And so what we've done is kind of explored some of the empirical literature coming out of the global south on the ways in which the transition and climate change is already producing injustices, and then trying to think of kind of the theoretical literature and how we can apply that to the just transition space. And through this, we hope we've put forward a more kind of expansive and transformative view of justice within the just transition. Just to kind of highlight a little bit of future work that we're working on at SEIS, we're working on a group which aims to advance the thinking and the research agenda around the climate care nexus, which kind of feeds into some of this work about rethinking about the structural understandings of our economy and the way the climate crises and the care crises are interlinked, and the ways in which both women's labor or care and the environment have been invisibilized in our economy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and we appreciate it was an expansive agenda that you've managed to stick more or less within the time. I guess just building, there was a lot of resonance between the first two papers, and I think that it was good to kind of see what the theoretical scaffold might be of applying a more differentiated and gendered perspective. But the question that I'm sitting with after listening to both of you is that if we look at the way the just transition is currently being approached and navigated through the political economy of South Africa, you know, this is a very high bar you're asking for. And even if we're talking about a relatively modest bar at the moment, it is almost impossible within the political economy constraints of the nature of the South African state at the moment, the state of civil society, to embed the best version of what is current policy. So just kind of how do we think about connecting the theoretical ambition and critique with a political economy and an institutional analysis about kind of what's possible, so that we can really, because I think the value of the transition lens is that it helps us to think systematically about short-term, medium-term, and long-term, and what the connections are to achieve a transformative outcome. And so it'd be useful maybe in discussion time to kind of reflect. No, we need to go to our next speaker, but thanks, Tracy. You can really refine your reflections. So again, thank you so much for joining us online. It's a real pity you can't be here.
Thank you for having me.
But we welcome you to sunny Cape Town. I'm sure the weather has by now turned foul in the UK. So we look forward to hearing more on your perspective. And thank you for your time. So you've got 15 minutes. At about 13 minutes, I'll just tap the microphone politely to remind you to round off. Thank you.
Got it. Thanks, Edgar. Very kind of you to pronounce my surname correctly, because the schedule mistyped it. I'm Gindo TAMPULOBON. I'm very pleased to be here, to be in this conference. I'm not very pleased to be in Manchester. It's foul now, as Edgar said. I'm going to share my screen. In the interest of internet connection, I will not be shown on screen, only my slide. I hope that is acceptable. Edgar, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you,
Okay.
and the screen is clear on the main screen in the room. Thank you.
Okay, I realize that at least I think I'm speaking to the converts here, but just to give a background, a couple of years ago, Boris Johnson apologized to the Minister of Energy, a delegate from Israel, to the COP26, because she is on a wheelchair. And believe it or not, the host organizer didn't provide the ramp so that she can lead her delegation and participate in the COP26. This is an example for me where incomes or educations or whatever she has can still not be converted to fully participating or her functioning in COP26. So there is a problem of converting from incomes, education to functioning, a problem of conversion handicap that Sen identified. Now, I'm going to talk about ideas of justice from Rawls and Sen that I apply to understand what's going on with climate change and the harms it brings on people, especially who are less able to carry the burdens and harms of climate change. So I then formulate a simple descriptive theory so that we can, as Edgar said at the very beginning, test it empirically and see what happens. I am going to talk about Indonesia. I am also going to talk about things that Tracy and Imraan and Katrina mentioned earlier, food insecurity and so on. But I start with a very simple water access or no water access to begin with. So that's the plan for this. The details of what I'm going to talk about is here in the paper, a working paper with UNU Wider, who very generously supported my sabbatical to think and write about this. We are all maybe familiar with the idea of distributive justice, as Katrina mentioned earlier, from Rawls. And one of the main tenets of that is inequality should be responded to by giving the maximum primary goods, incomes for instance, to the lowest in society, to the least able. This is the idea that we learn from Rawls on distributive justice. That is fair, justice as fairness. But Sen has got something else in mind when he talks about not a theory of justice, but an idea of justice. For him, it is not about an ideal society and how to order them, namely by focusing on giving more primary goods to the least able. The idea is more on identifying injustices and moving away from it and tackling it to get to a better place, especially for those who are less able. So that's one thing. Another difference is instead of focusing on primary goods, such as incomes, Sen focuses on capabilities, things that we value doing or being. Like Karina El-Harar value is being in the room with other delegates and contributing to COP26. So it's not her income that is more important. It is not her education, but the conversion of that income and that position into doing something about climate change with other delegates from around the world. And for the case that I'm working on now, it is about being hydrated. It is about being nourished. It is about being heard. It is about being healthy, quite separate from having access to incomes or education. And I think there's some resonance here to what has gone on in the past two presentations. So if I summarize those two key thinkers, I think I can say I'm focusing on maximum rule, giving the maximum to the least able with capabilities, not incomes. Because persons with disability, for instance, persons at the lower level of abilities face conversion handicap from incomes to functionings to capabilities. I'm not going to talk about this because I think we are all familiar that climate change is going to bring more harm to people, and more of them would be in places where least able to respond to that. And these are just some of the problems that are listed in any iteration of the assessment report. This is from assessment report 6th. Now, why justice is a key term in understanding this? I think in the last presentation, Katrina mentioned that people depending on fossil fuel-based development lead to much development for people in the north, where I'm staying at the moment, but harms people in the global south, where I originally hailed from. I hailed from Indonesia. So there is a between country injustice because those who benefited most are actually not carrying most of the burdens. Now, there are three at the bottom there, reasons or notes why the Global South are ill-equipped to respond to the harms of climate change. One, of course, is structural. Many relies on natural services, agriculture, and so on. Second, I think Edgar sort of touched on that. Governments have limited funds left to mitigate and to adapt to respond to climate change once development, more primary development purposes take their priority, like education or primary healthcare. And the third note is households themselves have limited funds to mitigate and adapt. And that's the reason why we have this between country climate injustice. More harms are put on the shoulders of those least able to respond to. So in terms that we have been familiar with from Rawls on Maximin, I think climate injustice can be said as that Maximin bads instead of Maximin goods. We put more bads on the harms of people least able to carry them. But I'm now looking at not between countries, but within countries. And I think some of the echoes of this have been mentioned in the first two talks. We talk about social norms that place men and women differently in society. I give you an example here in the last line there. Women in Bangladesh, some of them have to be accompanied by an adult male if they want to go out of the neighborhood. Imagine if heat waves or other climate shocks come and hit the place and there is no male around. It is very difficult for women to mitigate, to adapt. And that has nothing to do, as mentioned in one of the earlier talks, with biology or physiology. It is social norms that prevented some of those to respond effectively to climate shocks. So within country differences that arises from institutional, cultural, and social factors can make responding to climate harms differently. So, but of course, I have to say it is not only a problem in the Global South, it also happens in the Global North. And the case that I'm talking about here is between people younger and older age. And in Europe in 2003, in America in 1995, the heat shocks kills lots of older people, 739 in the US and about 70,000 excess deaths in Europe. And this has partly to do with social norms of how the neighborhood treat older people that are under extreme shocks to climate change. So this within country difference in norms and in culture can give rise to climate injustice. But I want to go beyond telling the stories behind that to empirically examining how much more bad for vulnerable groups, how much more bad for women or for persons with disability. Because if we can answer this, we can begin to think of a more just or fair foundation of organizing a society. Also, on a practical level, we can help a better disability benefit design. Or, last one, we can afford one important more capability for these groups, for women and for persons with disability, namely by giving them voice. So I want to test this new descriptive theory, the testing of exposure handicap, conversion from position to exposure to harms. And I use Susanas in Indonesia, that's a national socioeconomic survey. In 2018 and 2020, we have 514 cities, and we have more than 500,000 observations. I use as key variables disability indicators that the WHO and the World Bank has agreed on. And I focus on key outcomes, namely being without clean water for 24 hours or more, or being parched without drinking water for 24 hours or more. I'm not going to tell you why water is important. I'm sure you'll all agree with me that it is very important to drink regularly. But this is just some of the reasons that colleagues across in the Faculty of Biology and Medicine told me, and with whom I worked. It's important for our brain function. We have this picture of watering in our brains. And this is the survey that I used. I'm not going to read it to you. This
Sorry,
is in
Gindo,
Indonesian.
2 minutes left.
Yeah, 2 minutes left. Okay, thank you. So I'm testing whether indeed people with disability are at an increased harm, and by how much in Indonesia. So this is Indonesia, from Bamako in Mali to Addis in Ethiopia. That's the span of the country. And this is the share of people with disability by age group. Initially, not much, but by age 60 and 70, 1 in 4. And I found that if people have disability in the household, there is about 15% probability increased in being without water for 24 hours or more. That's the top line. And there is no difference between men and women. So in Indonesia, being with disability in the family increases the probability by about 15% of losing access to clean water. One last part. If we are interested in monitoring how much climate injustice do more harm to groups of people, like people with disability, can we get a number that we can talk to politicians or policymakers in order for them to quickly monitor? And I try to propose 2 index. One is climate injustice and another one is elasticity. But I am not going to talk much about this one. I'll stop here. Thank you, Edgar.
Thank you so much. And hat off to you for such an incredibly erudite and comprehensive presentation within the time frame. Looking forward to your further remarks during the Q&A time. We're going to swiftly move on to Julia Taylor, who's going to present on a just and energy transition, a gendered analysis. And I think what is striking for me is the room for sort of real innovation across different methodological categories, right? So we've heard quite a bit about looking at different population groups. We've also understood that it's important to look comparatively across geographies. And I think finally where it's perhaps best to understand the nexus dimension of issues is at the case study level. And this is our last paper, so thank you.
Just waiting for the slides. Great. Good morning, everyone, and thanks so much for having me. So this research I'm presenting is based on some fieldwork I did last year. And the real reason for the research was because I think often we kind of grapple with this idea of a just transition theoretically, conceptually. You know, it's thrown about very easily in some spaces, when actually, you know, is there a transition is the first question, because I think in many countries, actually the energy shift is more of an expansion than a transition. And is it just? You know, is there something in what's currently happening that indicates that there might be an increase in justice due to this decarbonization process? So yeah, these kind of big questions come up, and often we don't have a clear idea of what's happening already. And so I wanted to go and speak to people who live around solar power plants that have been built over the last 10 years in South Africa, and which is why I chose the Northern Cape. So South Africa, thanks. South Africa is a quite a kind of renewable energy resource rich country. So we have significant solar capacity, and much of that exists in the Northern Cape, which is quite a arid area, but has lots of sunshine. This picture is of a concentrated solar power tower in the Northern Cape near Upington. And I'm going to tell you a story about it later, but I think I'm going to get through the kind of most of the presentation first. So that's a picture of, and that's a picture of the concentrated solar power tower from the nearby community of Rosedale in Upington. So you can actually see it, and you can see that kind of like, it's not so great on the slide, but that bright point where the sun reflects onto this molten salt tower at the top. And yeah, I'll tell some stories about that if we have time at the end. Okay, so my rationale is, as I mentioned, we often talk about a just transition. It's an important issue, and it's a very important issue in the context of South Africa, where we do have multiple other issues, not just climate change, but also poverty, unemployment, and inequality. And there is this idea that low carbon sources of energy have a kind of warm and fuzzy feeling about them, that they are going to improve conditions for workers perhaps, and that they are more egalitarian than their carbon intensive and fossil fuel counterparts. That's a quote from Sovacool. But I think it holds quite true, and it's quite strange actually when you think about that. Like why is there that idea? Why is there this feeling that renewable energy is just all good? And just to kind of state up front, I'm not anti-renewable energy. I'm very pro-renewable energy. I really think we need a transition, but I do think there's nuance and kind of important issues we need to unpack within the kind of idea of transition. And so often there are the kind of framing of a transition looks at just kind of the net gain in jobs if we're looking at economic impact. It's like, oh, but there are going to be more jobs, so you know, workers should be happy, everyone should be happy. But actually, when you get any closer to it, you start to question, well, what kinds of jobs, what kinds of skills, and will it really improve lives? And also, what are the gendered impacts? Okay, so I've taken a feminist political economy approach to this question. And that means that I want to look further than the formal jobs, and further than the formal economy even. So a feminist political economy approach takes the whole economy and understands it as a system that incorporates the market, the household, and the state. And that the household is actually an area where significant work is happening, but it's just unpaid and undervalued and often invisible. And so the unpaid care work and other types of work conducted in the household, which are required to reproduce and maintain labor power, and have been socially constructed to be women's work, which is naturalized and undervalued, is often forgotten in discussions around the economy, transition, energy, etc. And so I've used social reproduction theory, which includes and highlights care work and other forms of unpaid subsistence labor in the broader process of capitalism, which includes the production of goods and services as well as life and labor. And three key institutions are the economy, the household, and the state, which kind of are overlapping and kind of co-created. But I've kind of used this framing to understand the dynamics in this Northern Cape case study. So this is where the fieldwork case studies, well, the fieldwork and the case studies are. So you can see the three towns in the Northern Cape of the country: Kuruman, Kathu, and Uppington. Kuruman and Kathu are kind of previously mining towns, and Uppington is actually kind of a mix, but has agricultural kind of as a history. It's a wine place, interestingly. And then if you look a bit closer, this is the map from the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Procurement Program, which is the program that South African government has run to develop renewable energy projects. So it's basically where the government has put out a bid or has requested bids from the private sector to build renewable energy plants. And this map shows where some of these plants have been built around the three case studies. So three case study towns. So I selected these based on the fact that they had 2 to 3 solar power plants around them. And so I wanted to understand how has the development of these solar power plants impacted workers who worked on them, local communities, as well as people who are currently working on the solar power plants. And then I also interviewed kind of government officials. So I conducted several interviews. There were, I think, about 23 with those different social groups to understand what the perceptions of these power plants are on the ground. I still can't get this clicker right. I don't know where I'm pointing. Sorry. So if we think about the kind of market or economy section of this social reproduction framework, I looked at then the gendered occupations in the solar power industry, kind of data from kind of the country. And while the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Procurement Program, which I'm going to call REAP, hasn't prioritized the employments of women or youth, it does have kind of targets for South African citizens and Black South African citizens and local communities. But they use this idea of job years as their categorization of kind of jobs created, which is a very slippery term because it means basically the equivalent of 1 year of full-time work. But often the work in these construction of solar power plants is in construction. So there's majority of jobs in the construction phase, and then it ends up being a couple of people on the site who are managing security and cleaning. So they use this kind of number, but it's actually very confusing when you're trying to engage with what that means. Like how many people are we don't actually know how many people are currently working on those plants today. And then industry reports state that women comprise about 33% of the workforce in solar and wind energy in South Africa, and with the highest number of women represented as temporary employees or unskilled occupations. And so we do then question kind of what is the pattern of employment, and is this different from mines and coal power stations? So then based on some of the interviews that I did, I also kind of asked what the experience was in the workplace for women. And based on interviews, the feedback was that only around 24% of the workforce on the solar power plants were women. But there were actually higher numbers of women in managerial roles. But there was definitely occupational segregation. So women worked in the office or as cleaners, whereas men were more likely to kind of be working on construction during the installation. There was also experiences of sexism and racism in the workplace. Then if we move to the household, women are still kind of largely responsible for the unpaid care work in the home, but not exclusively. So I interviewed several different workers who'd worked on the solar power plants, And, several of them were men who said that they lived with their elderly, uncle, and they have to care for them as well. So, it's a dynamic concept, but yeah, there is largely the majority of people who are working on unpaid care work in the home are still women in these communities. And also kind of they're working on, they also have the responsibility to earn income or grow food. So there's also kind of evidence of petty commodity production, short-term contracts as general workers, and grant income from other family members, or income from family members working on a mine or a solar power plant, and that this different array of livelihood strategies ends up forming a household's income. And so you can see that it's very precarious. Like nothing is permanent. There's bits and pieces from different people. And so there's an argument that the market and wage opportunities created by the solar power plants haven't actually improved the situation for any of these households, because they had a short-term job in the construction of the solar power plant, but now they're unemployed again. So most of the people I interviewed were unemployed, but had worked on the solar power plants briefly. And then in terms of the conditions of work on the solar power plants, so the solar industry is really interesting in comparison to the mining industry, because there's a distributed nature of the value chain. So in South Africa, there's a coal mine, and then next door there's a coal power station, and they kind of have a very close structure. There's significant labor involved in both of those activities, whereas the power is also generated kind of right there. Whereas the solar industry, the minerals are mined kind of across the world, then they're processed and manufactured into solar technologies in often mostly China, and then they're imported to South Africa, then they're installed. So there's this very different value chain structure. And what that means for labor requirements is that actually, because we're not producing the solar power technology here, we don't have as much kind of job requirement for that value chain. And often often an issue is that European firms hold the expertise in that value chain. So there are kind of international companies, often from France or Germany, who fly over, install the power plant, and then fly back. Or Spanish, construction firms who come, or like solar firms who come and construct these things and then leave. And then you also use subcontractors on the ground to hire other workers. And this kind of ended up we had a lot of stories about strikes on the solar power plants, and bad working conditions where workers wouldn't get paid on time. They had issues with bonus payments that were promised. And so these bad working conditions contradict the assumption that low carbon energy is more equitable and just than the fossil fuel industry. Lastly, the community's kind of perceptions of the solar power plants were not very strong, I guess, is the first interesting point. They were fairly indifferent. A lot of people said, well, it hasn't actually changed the price of my electricity. I haven't gotten increased electricity access. So what's the use? Who's it benefiting? And there was an interesting case where this power plant on the picture was actually next door to a manganese mine. And so because mines don't have the same load shedding schedules that everyone else in the country does, the mine obviously continues to have power when everyone else is in the dark. And so there's this perception from kind of local people that actually who's benefiting from the solar power plant? Is it the mine? And so whether there's a shift in our minerals energy complex or not, just because the energy source is changing, is a big question. And also the solar power plants haven't improved energy access or affordability locally, even though they're plugging into the grid, and like that should be increasing access kind of nationally. That's not experienced kind of for communities in that area. So just to kind of sum up, in the economy, short-term work opportunities and exploitation of workers can actually increase the crisis of social reproduction. In the household, solar power plants have not improved access to electricity or other important resources for subsistence, such as land and water. And then the state also continues to fail in public service provision and seems to kind of support the existing structure and status quo rather than the survival of local populations. So this is quite a depressing picture, but I think we have some lessons about what we can think about that would be more meaningful, I think, for local communities around these solar power plants. But I know I'm probably out of time, so I'll just kind of end there and say, I think there are ideas for what can be more relevant for local communities, and I think energy access and addressing energy poverty is kind of the #1 thing that would be really kind of transformative, I think, in a just energy transition. Thanks.
Thanks so much. I must commend the organizers. I mean, there's incredible coherence and continuity across the different papers. So we are on a very, very tight time schedule. So I'm just going to open the floor immediately. Tracy can go first with her response to my provocation, and then I'll just collect some hands, and then we'll do one round of comments, questions, and then one round of responses. Yeah, so there's there are people online listening, so we need to use the microphone.
So just in terms of that issue, I think the first part is about being able to really do procedural justice in the way in which is described in the JET framework, but which is not being delivered at all at the moment. And I think the framing of that in a feminist perspective is really useful. I mean, Joan Tronto talks about our first ethic of care is to see other people. So actually doing procedural justice, hearing multiple voices and actually hearing them is critical to a better problem definition and a better, more equitable energy transition. Of course, what we have is we've got strongly entrenched administrative practices in the South African state of how you do public participation. And what we find is that even when the PCC issues a mea culpa and says, yeah, we didn't do public participation properly at Komati, their remedy a few weeks later is exactly the same thing as what they did before. So they're very strongly entrenched administrative practices. They're very strong biases within the state about who has expert knowledge, who doesn't have expert knowledge, in addition to all of the practical biases to people participating. So I think, it has to be something that makes people within the state aware of the benefits of doing something differently. In terms of resources and funding for a different type of transition, I think it's really critical that in South Africa's case, the International Partners Group and the Global North in general sort of, let me be polite about this, recalibrate their perceptions of what an energy transition is or should be. If they significantly want countries like South Africa to rapidly decarbonize, then they must accept that there has to be substantial broad-based support for that. And at the moment, that doesn't exist in South Africa. And it's not a question of educating people about the issues of climate change. The bottom line is that the average South African doesn't really care about climate change because they care about how they're going to feed their families tomorrow and next week. It's a perfectly rational response. The just transition, and as all the other papers have shown, for people outside of Mpumalanga and outside the coal mining areas, there's no benefit for them in this current conceptualization of a just energy transition. And if the Global North and the IPG want to have a rapid decarbonization of the South African economy, they need to take on board the conceptualization of what is a just transition from the point of view of the average South African, not the average person in Brussels.
Thanks, Tracy. So let's collect a series of reflections, comments, questions. And please introduce yourself very briefly. I'm going to bring the microphone.
Thanks, Edgar. I'm Andrew Donaldson. I worked at the Treasury for a long time. I want to just add a fiscal footnote to Tracy's point about the importance of getting the fiscal subsidy for electricity supply to low-income households right. It's crazy to think that you should spend billions and billions of rand putting in electricity connections to poor households and then not provide a fiscal subsidy that is sufficient to allow them to do anything more than switch on a few light bulbs and boil a kettle twice a day. I'm not sure we could get to 350. That's quite a high target, but it needs to be substantially higher than 50 kilowatts and kilowatt hours a month. Eskom yesterday in Parliament said it should be 100. Well, I think that's a sort of first step towards something that makes sense. But the footnote is this: fiscally, we're already paying for a much higher level of consumption of electricity. A 280 or 250 billion rand fiscal recapitalization of Eskom, 50 to 60 billion of which is a subsidy to or a transfer to municipalities in the municipal debt relief program that Treasury has tagged on to the Eskom support mechanism, essentially is the post facto realization of the underfunding of electricity to low-income communities and settlements over the last decade or so. We just have to do honest accounting, and we would be recognizing a larger fiscal subsidy built into these numbers. We do have to get this right, and we need to get this message across to the Treasury and COGTA and Parliament now, because the debt relief program to municipalities will fail if it doesn't happen. So,
thanks, Andrew. Anyone else?
Thank you so much to the panel. It was really wonderful. I wish we could blare that to politicians and policymakers from every loudspeaker. I guess I'm quite curious.
Introduce yourself.
Sorry, I'm Zach. I'm working on the presidential employment stimulus. And I guess I'm curious, one of the really powerful statements was what you mentioned, that we put the most harm on the shoulders of people least able to carry them. One instrument we do have that disproportionately targets the most vulnerable in society is social protection, generally the elderly, women, children, the people that have disabilities. I was wondering if you can comment on what the role of social protection can be in both a just energy transition and more broadly within the context of climate change. We're seeing concepts like adaptive social protection broadly on the African continent. And I was wondering whether if you also see a role of social protection as being transformative and challenging these underlying inequalities rather than, like you mentioned, just keeping the status quo as it is. I'd really appreciate some reflections on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm Samane Hemmat. I'm a social development specialist with the World Bank. These were really interesting papers and presentations. One question on public participation and procedural justice. Are there any examples, or has this been done well anywhere? And what are like the key failures or the key areas to improve in terms of how people are being included in the policy making and decision making around the transition process?
The room is heating up.
Thank you. I'm Jody Brown, so I'm from Western Cape Government. I'm in Climate Change Directorate. Just two questions. So firstly, I really like the mention of intersectionality in the second paper. And I'm finding that something very fascinating and important, especially as we consider the just transition. But as Edgar also mentioned, sort of the limits of the political economy that we have. So in reality, how do we really adapt or implement that lens of intersectionality, especially in a way so that we, for example, gender is one component of intersectionality. How do we make sure that we're sort of not contradicting in this complex system that we're adapting to? And then secondly, with the case study of the Northern Cape, maybe just some insights of the sort of receiving environments of these renewable energy power plants. The stats that you put about the skew of women employment, for example, is there an awareness to sort of the amount of women, for example, seeking jobs, or are those communities also suffering from these sort of social dimensions of the woman must stay at home and men must go work and those sort of dynamics? Thanks.
final contribution.
Thank you. This has really been very valuable information. My name is Matoho Makutwan. I'm from an NGO called IPIETERSE. Our work is mostly around women-led climate justice and access to sexual and reproductive health, especially during a climate crisis. And I also want to say something about the public participation process that I once attended, and I thought it was just in shambles. And I think it's unfair to expect communities to contribute to policies which they have no idea of. A climate change bill has been, a group has gone, a presidential climate change, the group that goes to communities. Yeah. So, and they get to the site in the morning and, you know, all the documents are there and people are called from the community. They sit around in the hall and then taken through the, well, it's a thick document, which I don't know if the community actually understood, if the counselor is in charge of making sure that people understand. I mean, climate change 101, how many of us really understand what happens in that space? But people are expected to actually give their contributions to a bill that has no single word on gender, and people don't feel like they are part of, their voices are not in the document. What you just mentioned now about intersectionality, all the vulnerable people, the disabled, the LGBTI, how do they get their voices into a document which they actually really understand? But unlike a document that is just a tick box exercise, that will just be taken to the NCOP and then we are told here's an act which doesn't speak to the voices on the ground. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So I think there's a rich bouquet of questions. Gindo, I know that most of the questions refer to the South African context, but I'm sure that there's some extrapolation.
I'm happy to learn.
So I will invite you at the end to come in. So I'm just going to ask the panelists to each maybe share a final thought, and feel free to respond to any of the comments that you feel resonated most with you. Don't address all of them. So please be selective. We only have 7 minutes left. Thanks.
So just briefly, I mean, Andrew, I take the fiscal points. And the thing is we already have a free basic electricity subsidy, and it only reaches 25% of households. But I think National Treasury has a plan for that, they assure me. On the issue of public participation and procedural justice and who's doing it properly, I'd say no one. I mean, if I talk to also colleagues in Indonesia and that, we're working on a program now where we're trying to conceptualize what we'd call a transition capable state, which we'd say is a state that is able to design and implement collaborative processes of problem solving. But the first thing is to understand really the barriers to that within the state, and then understanding the practical areas, and to change this idea that participation is some expert makes a policy and then you come and ask people if they like it or not, but actually to really start from the beginning. And I think in our program what we're conceptualizing is a long-term program of understanding those practices, working with public servants to make a strong case for the benefits of doing things differently. And people are starting to see, I think the energy transition is really interesting, because we do all sorts of public participation badly in South Africa, but the energy transition has given it an international sort of lens, and it's a real opportunity to recalibrate the relationship between state and citizen. I think that we shouldn't miss.
Thanks. I'll maybe address the question also on intersectionality, and also Edgar's question, because I think kind of, Edgar, you said that we've got a current boundary of our current political economy framework, but I think we're at risk, unless we think quite transformatively, of sinking all of the money we put into a political economy framework that can only reproduce these inequalities, as opposed to kind of, it's almost a causality or directionality issue of kind of, unless you then kind of fund alternative approaches to change the structure, then, maybe you can get more just outcomes. So it's kind of saying, I think at the moment we're thinking about, okay, how can we get the absolute kind of maximum within the political economy framework, but that actually may not be very much at all. Whereas if you change that structure, you can use maybe fewer resources to get a more just outcome. Hope that's clear. And yeah, so I think that relates also to the intersectionality point of kind of how do you embed these within broader frameworks right from the get-go within the vision, because then you don't have to kind of tack them on at the very end, and then it suddenly becomes like an extra cost to suddenly consider women in the process. And yeah, on the social protection point, we're actually starting a new project which is looking at social protection in the just transition. So I think we'll be able to feedback some results in the next few years. But I think one of the key questions is kind of thinking both about being able to think about broad-scale social protection in a very uncertain world and an increasingly harmful world, but then also having social protection that addresses very specific changes, so a change out of kind of coal mining. And so kind of what kinds of mixes of contributory, universal, kind of where should the state contribute, but also not letting kind of private actors simply go scot-free because we say that the state, you know, must be providing social protection. So yeah, those are some of the things that we're already thinking about.
Thanks so much. I think I'm going to respond to kind of the two questions on, so firstly the question on social protection, and also your question, Jody, about kind of what is the situation in these towns and what is the unemployment dynamic. And I think there is, similar to kind of the broader South African unemployment picture, is that there's higher unemployment on behalf of women, and particularly black women are the most, you know, have the highest levels of unemployment. But that doesn't mean that they're not looking for work. And my experience was that every single person I spoke to was looking for work, you know, whether a woman or a man. And often they weren't in a two-earner household. They were in, you know, multiple earner households, but small and piecemeal. And so there's an argument that the social grant system isn't enough to kind of make ends meet for these households. And so that links to the social protection question, where, well, what social protection, what social, you know, security structure would support these households? And I think we can think about, you know, the grant system and subsidization of energy and affordability, but there's also, I think, broader public services that just are really fundamental to survival. Healthcare, water access. Most people I spoke to were still using shared taps. So you kind of have to walk 500 meters down the road to get a tap. So I think very basic things like that, kind of, so the idea of universal basic services, as well as, you know, income and other support is really important. Thanks.
So I wanted to take up your kind of high bar provocation and then also deal with sex question. So I'd make 2 points, Edgar. The first is, what does a gender lens provide us with? I think for me it kind of allows me to see a much more complete economic system that kind of other views are kind of quite blind to, and it kind of illuminates really important kind of relationships in the economy that if you don't deal with, you're going to leave large portions of marginalized communities behind. So I think that framework has to be part of the lens that we put to this problem. On the possibilities, I think we have to think about this problem globally and kind of break out of a South African bias. I'm very encouraged by the kind of independent expert panel report that calculated the costs of this. So the broad numbers are, we need about $4 trillion per year globally. We need $1 trillion per year for developing countries. The good news is that our societies have harnessed resources like this in the past. These are not problems that we haven't solved. The bad news is I don't think there's an imagination in the global south and a kind of a real, in the global north, and a real kind of commitment to deal with the issue. Just on the social protection question, I think compensation schemes or the kind of principle of compensation is absolutely key to the climate problem, and the fact that there's large kind of losers, there's people who win, and the kind of at a broad and general level, the fact that the problem has been caused by one group that is not going to proportionately share the costs puts the compensation issue at the forefront. But I do think we need to think broader about social protection. This, for me, isn't a question about a grant system that is going to set a floor. I think we have to bring back things like active labor market policies, etc., and much more broader ideas about social protection.
Thanks, Imraan. Gindo, you've got the final reflection, and then I'll close the session. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Edgar. Listen, my prayer this morning is I will learn from you all, and I think I've been answered. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it. So so this was a really rich and fantastic set of papers and contributions, and I wish we had another hour to kind of get into the next layer of engagement. So I just want to share two reflections for me to kind of push the debate forward. So I think I was struck by the philosophical references across the papers. And I'm also struck that as sort of within a broader decolonial moment, we've kind of reached into certain post-colonial and feminist and other subaltern philosophies, that we're not engaging with the pragmatist tradition, because I think there's something about the crossover between pragmatism and some of the radical philosophies that maybe is really relevant for the current moment. So just sort of one point. On the whole economy piece, I'm always struck by the fact that, so John Friedman wrote this book in 1992 called Empowerment. And in that intervention where he was trying to engage with sort of as a planner with the heterodox emergence of heterodox economics at the time, was kind of framing the importance of incorporating informality, but also, because he worked mainly in the Latin American context, the importance of the Black economy and the illicit economy. And I'm still struck by a lot of the interventions around that is trying to bring a feminist and an environmental lens to the whole economy frame. But there's a choice to be, it seems, theoretically. We've got to decide, are we interested in a normative understanding of economic transactions or in an empirical descriptive frame? Because that choice is quite important about what we're going to measure and how we're going to think about interactions and so on. And because so much of the informal bleeds into the illicit, and so much of the power relations that we're trying to understand through a feminist perspective stems from the criminalization and the sort of the underpinnings of structural violence, I think there's a really important set of quite difficult questions there. My final point as an urbanist is space. So I'm really struck again when I listen to debates about intersectionality, about the different methodological entry points, that there isn't an explicit engagement with the difference space makes, whether it's to gender relations, whether it's to value chains, to, for example, how renewable technologies have a completely different spatial logic, not just in the way of how the value chain works, as we've heard, but also potentially about how we structure social enterprises at the neighborhood scale that can be owned and driven by communities, that can in fact be the backbone of a national or a regional system. So yeah, so it was sort of just something that I think would be fantastic to unpack a little bit more. So just to thank the panelists for being brilliant, for being disciplined, and for being generous. and sort of was able to fold themselves into a very tight time frame. And then just to also thank the technical team for making sure that this hybrid situation could work, and in particular to Gindo for sharing with us the really fascinating work that you're doing in the Indonesian context, and may our Global South engagements prosper and deepen. Thank you, everyone.